Hello and welcome back to another episode of CoronaCast. This is the fourth intro that I'm trying to record for this one, so you get about 30 seconds in and you hate what you say and you just delete it. That's how the podcast game works for those who don't know. So you will have video again at some point soon. I've had to change the studio location a couple of times, and so right now I don't have the most ideal background, and the horse picture is such a big hit that I want to make sure that it's got the perfect location for you guys to see again. So, but I do want to note that we are also live on the iTunes podcast store as of now. The official link is out there. For some reason, the RSS feed was going up to the iTunes store, but not actually, an official iTunes show. So now it's an official podcast show. So go check that out. We're making progress here. People just writing me emails saying thank you. Bob, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear
All
me?
right, perfect. Your video is completely still, so just want to make sure you're still there, but good to know.
Here.
Oh, there we go. We're back. All right. Even in 2020, we still have a lot of technical issues, as we're finding out more and more. So,
Yeah.
Bob, thank you so much for joining me. Bob is a great friend back from St. Louis University, and I know what you're asking yourself, especially if you didn't go to SLU. Is this a St. Louis University podcast? You've had 3 straight guests from St. Louis University, and I say, we're coming at you. We the SLU people are here, but there'll be more of diversity of guests coming up soon. But Bob, thank you for joining us today. Bob is a teacher for Teach for America in New York City, and I wanted to get his kind of thoughts on how the whole coronavirus thing is going in New York City, for one, and then also having to transition his lower income student population onto a Zoom and onto a learning platform, and how that's been for him. So, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.
And the first thing I want to start out with is New York is obviously kind of the major hotspot in the country right now. We just saw the video yesterday, Monday, the 30th, of the USS or USNS Mercy coming to port. Have you seen the ship yet?
No, honestly, I only leave my house to go on runs and to go to the grocery store. So I have not made it down to where it's docked around Midtown.
Uh-huh. And so what is the shelter-in-place order right now? Is it obviously just essential businesses, but is it being pretty strictly enforced, or there's still a lot of people out and about and on the streets?
Yeah, so I'd call it a loose shelter in place. So officially, groups bigger than 10 are not allowed outside together. The police will break up groups that are larger than 10. And then it's just essential businesses. So there's no restaurants that are open that you can actually eat at. Everything is pickup or delivery. And then even, we've been really trying to eat out, which sounds weird, but we've been kind of trying to keep the businesses that we normally go to open by getting delivery from them. But we've noticed in the past 4 or 5 days, even that's starting to drop off. You only in New York, it's crazy to only have 2 to 3 options to deliver to you now, which I know is not the norm everywhere. But when you go outside, if it's a rainy day, you're going to see maybe 2, 3 people. If you go outside and it's a sunny day, we had like 75 degrees. Sometimes it's hard to tell that this is even happening, which can be kind of anxiety driving. It's hard to know. I would say this last week has been the biggest change in terms of just how everyone collectively seems to be kind of like in the mindset of, oh shit, this is real.
Well, in the past week has really been when the numbers started to have a big uptick, especially in the New York City area. Do people kind of understand what's going on right now? Because I think, even in Denver, a lot of people are kind of treating this like a snow day, essentially. And, they're going outside and they're hanging out and don't seem to quite understand the full implications of this. But New York, which is a lot farther along as far as closer to their peak, I would assume, than Colorado, are people really understanding what's going on now, or is it still kind of, people wondering?
To paint that story, we kind of got to go back to when this all was beginning. New York was one of the first places to get a case in Westchester County, which is the county just north of Manhattan. You can get to Westchester in about 25-minute drive. And at that time, I was still teaching in class just like normal, and it was one of those elephants in the room. We knew this thing was happening, and the official word was basically a letter from the Department of Education, and beyond that, everything was on you. So I chose to just discuss it with students, and at that time, we didn't really know what it would be. We didn't really think things would be shut down, and most people kind of just thought it was not a big deal, even when it was, you know, less than 20 miles away from us. That has seemed to switch, but like I said, probably not until the last 5 days. I mean, last week when you would go to the grocery store, people would still be crowding you in line. Now they finally have it where they've mapped out where you can stand 6 feet away from each other. But like I said, it was a really scary thing to go to the grocery store, especially as more and more word comes out of younger people dying from the disease. So I would say there's been a big uptick in what seems to be awareness.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it too. And then when that letter that you referenced from the Department of Education about kind of warning you of this could be coming, when did you receive that letter, and did it have, protocols in place as far as saying like, okay, we're going to go online, and what was the kind of the stages of how you got to, going all online?
So this is lame, but I'll do it. I gotta say, the perspective I'll give, it's only going to be from one teacher. Especially if you've never lived in New York or you've never had any contact with the public school system, please don't take what I say as like mapping for the whole public school system. Schools here are so wildly different from each other. But I can give you the context of what happened at my school, which I would say, like, I got to give huge props out to my admin because I think they were way more on top of it than normal schools. But at the time that we received the first letters, I think the reaction to most of the people in my school was just that stick with what the letter said. You didn't want to get off too far off. And at that point, it was just like, this is a thing. Wash your hands. And that was probably, I could get the date, but I don't remember it. Probably about a week and a half, 2 weeks before things shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, we all just did exactly what we were told, right? Like, at that point, we were more worried about getting people too afraid, that we just kind of stuck with that story. It wasn't until 2 days before the official call. So schools were officially closed on a Sunday, which was 2 weeks ago. It wasn't until I think the Wednesday before that anyone at the school even talked about closing down. And that was, I think, early compared to a lot of the other schools. It's just factual that the Department of Education had no plan.
Mm-hmm.
There was no plan in the letters. To my knowledge, nothing in the letters said that you should be planning for this or that this was even a possibility. It was completely on the schools. And even at that point, when it did happen, when we did get the shutdown, one might think that like the Department of Ed would come out and say like, we're shutting down. Here is the platform you're going to teach on. We bought you a partnership with Zoom or with Canvas, excuse me. That didn't happen either. When the shutdown officially came, it was completely school by school. You had to figure it out. You had to get your students' laptops, and then you had to figure out what they were going to use. And it was a big kudos to my school for having been developing a plan, just to be safe. I'm sure there are schools in New York who did not think about it at all.
And then just before we keep going on this discussion, will you tell people a little bit about the demographics of the school that you're at and how you those demographics kind of made your school a little bit less prepared than a very like elite, wealthy private school in the New York City area?
Sure. So New York City is the largest public school system in the nation, to my knowledge. So there's complete wealth disparity, the same as there is in all of New York City. I work at a school where most of my students do qualify for free or reduced lunch. By no means are all of my schools what you would say impoverished. I would never describe them as that, but a lot of our students are dealing with financial hardship. And a lot of my school, a fair amount of my students, they do receive their lunch and their breakfast at school. And so for that reason, shutting down was really hard because we knew that some of our students relied on our school for their lunches and for their breakfasts. Beyond that, I mean, there are schools like Stuyvesant High School, which are like, the Ivy League feeders, who I'm sure their students all have MacBooks. All of the technology that my school receives, usually it's through grants that teachers write. So a lot of, we're very fortunate to have gotten a few of the grades have complete one-to-one laptops. But we're talking, Chromebooks. We're not, nothing out in the wild. Definitely no Apple products. but not every school that looks the way that my school does has that stuff. New York City, I mean, is the type of place that across the street there might be a school that's amazing, and then the one right next to it, or even in the same building, right? Is not great. It all depends on the staff that you have. It's not really dependent on the people going there, which is a really unfortunate thing about New York. So we had a unique trouble where we had to make sure every student had the technology they needed. Right? We could not just assume that parents could go out and get technology. We kind of took it on as a staff to that was our job, is to figure out where they were going to get it from. And so for us, a lot of the laptops we use in class every day, like in carts, we distributed those. Right in the moment, it was about getting a student a laptop so they could keep learning. Yeah.
And you say your school had been planning for this for a little bit before, and when did they start planning? Like, was this something to get your students virtual? Was this before even the coronavirus pandemic hit? Or
No.
when did you start kind of planning? Like, how quick was that turnaround to say, like, okay, wow, this is going to come to America versus, okay, now we got to shut down schools and go completely
No,
virtual?
remember, Corona started in January in China. It's March. We didn't start talking about it until the week before this hit. And again, I'm gonna say, my school was on top of it. Huge kudos to my admin for knowing that they should be doing that stuff. The official shutdown didn't come until a Sunday, and then the official planning time that was given was the next Tuesday. And we had a week off after things shut down just for planning, and that shows you, most schools, they didn't have a plan. They were creating it in that moment, and we were lucky that we had started those things. But in January, I don't think my students would have known what Corona was unless they were really actively engaged in global affairs. Yeah.
And what kind of platforms have your school been using? You said maybe you got to already have a partnership with Zoom. Like, what were your preparations for getting these kids onboarded to go virtual? And then how has that been working today? Do you have regular class schedules where you teach your 7 a.m. class at 7 a.m. or how has that been working?
Yeah, great question. It's funny because I'll come back to that. But so one of the technologies we use most frequently throughout the year is Google Classroom, which is a platform that allows you to post materials. So say I could create a Google document, and I could post that on Google Classroom, and that would make a copy for each of the students that they could edit. So that's my way of making a packet or a worksheet for the students. We debated having students go to a Zoom class every day, but we kind of talked about, are you really going to get 30 kids every single class to switch over? It was just going to be too much. So we rely on materials posted to Google Classroom, and then every day every teacher has a Zoom call office hours where any kid can come and they can ask questions about those assignments. Zoom is great because you can share your screen. So oftentimes a student will come to me, I'll share my screen looking at their assignment on Google Classroom. There are way better technologies out there. I don't know if anyone's ever, anyone who's taken grad school online or something, they know about Canvas, which can order things. I don't have that ability. Canvas, you can block someone from moving ahead before they're done. I can't do that. We kind of chose Google Classroom because at the end of the day, the biggest problem was what are you going to be able to teach the students how to use when they're not in front of you? Were we going to get this new technology and then try to teach it to them from our apartments, or were we just going to rely on the one they knew and then double down on it? And so we kind of chose that. Again, I know that I sound like a broken record, but we're lucky that we use Google Classroom and our kids had seen it before. That's not true for every student in the country, right? There are students who probably had pen and paper their whole lives. This might be their first thing. And I can talk a little bit too later on about I think there's a big misconception about how much technology students are exposed to. It's been really interesting to see how different generations respond to this thing.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was talking with my sister's friend today who has an older teacher in college, and the teacher just canceled the class because he didn't want to learn how to use Zoom and all that stuff. But going back to your point about not switching over to Canvas or not having the ability to use those platforms, like even from my position as a graduate student, University of South Florida had to move over to a Microsoft server from Google so that way they could use Zoom. And even for the graduate students, that was kind of a difficult transition. And so, even on our end,
University of Phoenix students are killing it right now.
DeVry, University of Phoenix, like those students, oh man, they're going to win the NCAA tournament next year. Let's go, DeVry. But one thing I did want to talk to you about, and especially something that kind of is interesting at a lower income school where you maybe don't have parents of students that are so technologically adept as you might have in an upper income household. How are these students adjusting, and do even all of these students have internet access at home?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's a misconception that because, and I think this comes from so the people that are thriving, from my perspective, are millennials. And that's millennial teachers, but it's also millennial parents as well. Because like we have computer sense. I know how to create a Google document, and I know how to make a Google document that like makes sense to a user. Making a worksheet's not hard. You like ask your question and then you create some space, right? But creating one that online that like where to type, that takes some computer sense. And so I'm noticing a lot of the millennial teachers really stepping up and doing really well with that. And I think a lot of the older teachers and some of the millennial teachers assume that our students have computer sense because they've grown up with technology their whole lives. And I think that's a misconception. I think our kids have really, really great phone sense. So if a program is given to them in a way that looks like Instagram, in a way that looks like Snapchat where it scrolls, they have great sensibility. They can, if something comes up that they don't know how to do, they can figure it out. However, because of the exposure to computers, at least with most of the students, this doesn't speak for everyone, obviously. When they hit a snag, they're tripped up a little bit more. And I just think they haven't been as exposed to computers. That being said, I think when we started, we were really worried. We had no idea what to expect. And one by one, every single student has rise to the challenge. It's been really cool to see like some of the kids who are really quiet, who would never ask you a question in person, they're absolutely killing it, right? Some of the kids who really do want a teacher there all the time, they're still killing it because they kind of feel that because of the ways that we're providing the instruction. They do kind of have a teacher there in a way. And I could talk about how I do that. So I think it's been really cool to see who is being successful, who will like stereotypically not be the success story in the classroom. So I feel like it's been a kind of a cool leveler. I think there's a lot of lessons to be taken from that. Big one is if you're not a millennial and you're not comfortable with technology and you're a teacher, like I think it's your responsibility to learn it and to teach it. And that's just the reality. And like, that's it. I'm sorry. I know that's harsh and it's hard, but like our students need to know these things, not just for pandemics, but like for college, for
in general.
Teacher.
Yeah. And especially coming from a household where they may not be as, have as much technology around them. I think your point about being phone savvy versus computer savvy is something that a lot of people don't think about. And especially with lower income where there's potentially a lot more cell phones, but not as many computers. I think that is something really interesting to be aware of that these students do face. Now, one thing I did want to ask about these classes, and I do think it's really interesting that you bring up like people who may not necessarily have been, a class leader have a chance to be through an online platform. But I think about students who are like me where I know I'm not going to do as well just from a learning standpoint and from a grade standpoint doing online classes, just the way I work. So how have you as a teacher adapted your teaching style to, one, knowing that A's, B's, C's, and D's are not going to be the same when you have an online class platform? How are you adjusting to a student who may be pretty successful in the classroom, but then doesn't show you that online just because of the online aspect, not necessarily because of their abilities or their motivation?
Sure. First thing, any teacher that's doing this, you have to remember, like, anything you did in the classroom, you have to make it live online. Like, if you're not, then your class is automatically worse. So, like, little things. Very, very routinely, I'll have a student read the question to the class, right? Could someone read question number 1 for us? Um, Obviously, I can't do that now. So what do I do instead? I record myself reading the questions out loud. So if you were the student who like reading the question would have been the barrier to you doing it, right? If I hadn't recorded it, you would have been done. That was it. But with giving you the option, then you can take that on yourself and like, oh, I really do like when Mr. Garvey reads. I do the same thing for readings. Every single reading that we post, either me or my co-teacher will record ourselves reading it. You don't have to click on it, and I think that's just to get it to like the normal class, right? You got to fill in those spaces. But then beyond that, like more than ever, you've got to be making an. I think that most of a teacher's job is character building. Um, and so because you're not doing that as much in person, you've got to build that into other places. I'm lucky that my school has a great system where I check in with about 12 students every week. And one of the things that we do is that we build a schedule for the week, right? Like that's a hard skill, and it's something you have to virtually teach. So I give them a spreadsheet and I say like, here are your hours, schedule some time, right? Um, that's something that we would expect a college student to be able to do, but at a high school level, you've got to teach that, and that's a great skill for the students to learn. But and that's motivating for the student who like would be like you or me. Like I would have been blowing this off. Um, the other thing I have noticed though is like it's okay to blow it off for like a week, but after 2 weeks, they're so bored. They just a lot of them have been coming back around to it. And I would say like anyone who's out there and is like the youth of America suck. I'm like no, like they're doing awesome. Like the world just fell apart, and they're still like, what are chromosomes? And your X chromosome decides what? Like you know what I mean? Like people around them are dying, and they're still coming every day and they're still doing the work. So like to me, I'm like, yeah, that's resilience. That's freaking awesome. But you have to like purposefully teach that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in the class, I would, if they're not motivated, I stop and do a speech. Like that's what you do. So I mean, maybe that gives me an idea. Maybe I need to be doing a motivational video as well. I don't know.
You can share those with the Corona kids here at CoronaCast too. We could use a nice little motivational video every morning. So, if it works for Public City school kids, then it'll work for us. So,
Yeah.
and I think too, like even talking about that adjustment period, like for me, the first week and a half I was home trying to do everything school and work online. I know that my work slipped just because not because I was working any less, but just because of the adjustment period of I'm not, going to a place that I associate with working hard and doing all those things. I'm sitting, I'm 10 feet away from my bed, so it's been difficult transition in that way. So it is impressive to see kind of some of that resilience from the students. One thing I do want to ask you about too and see kind of what plans are put in place, especially for students who have a tougher home life where school and then after school curricular activities are kind of an escape from that rough home life. What plans were put in place for them? I mean, obviously there's not a whole lot you can do, but how are you making sure that those students that you at least knew have a tougher home life are still able to keep up with everything, even though they have the difficulty of being at home?
The biggest, I'll say a couple things. First, I got to give a huge shout out to guidance counselors who are still holding online hours, online sessions. If you have some of our students meet with a guidance counselor regularly. If you get that in school, you still get that at home. So they'll do a video call with the kids, which is awesome. That's stuff that I never would have thought about at all. And they're still maintaining those connections. And yeah, like one of the things we had to think about was a lot of our students, because I'm in high school, a lot of them are likely going to be watching their siblings or helping their little siblings do online learning, which I mean, shout out to all of the freaking elementary school teachers out there. I have no idea how you're doing it. Like at least I can make an assignment and say go. Like I have no idea how you're teaching a student to read. But a lot of our students, they're probably watching their students, or maybe they just like I don't want to paint this picture that all my students have these like crazy, home lives. It could just be that they don't like their sibling. I would not have wanted to be around my brother for 2 weeks at a time. That sounds horrible. So for that reason, our staff decided to do about 30 minutes a day for each class. So in total, you're looking at about 3 hours of work because there's new responsibilities that are coming up in life, and we have to adjust for that, and then and then go from there. If we find out that we can push the students more, then we'll push the students more. But we don't want to overwhelm them. The student, because I also find the students that do have more responsibility at home, they tend to be your most responsible students. That's not always true, but that's a lot of the times.
Yeah. And I think, too, this is a time where every student can learn their own responsibility as well, maybe in a way that they wouldn't have had they been in a classroom. So there are certainly some positives coming out of that.
Oh,
now,
yeah. How many students are reading? They're reading. I mean, we both did it, right? Someone else volunteered to read it, so you kind of let them read it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got to do all the thinking. Maybe you call your friend, which is awesome. I hope my students are like video calling each other and doing it together. But for how many students who were in the middle are now getting pushed to being the best that they can be? That's great motivation.
Yeah, or we've all been in that group project where you went with somebody because you knew they were going to do 75% of the work, whereas now it almost has to be that even split sometimes with the group projects. Now, one thing we did kind of talk about your school in general and your students in general, but just for you as a teacher, what has been the most difficult transition you've had to going completely virtual? And then what has maybe been something that surprised you about the simplicity of going online and going virtual?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been much easier than for others. Like I said, I'm a millennial. Most of the time, I'm designing my lessons on a Google Doc, anyways. So it's actually been kind of freeing in terms of my time, because I can get up right at 8, make some coffee, and like get right on. You know what I mean? I don't have to take the subway. I could go for a jog like whenever I'm feeling great. It's kind of nice. What's hard is like managing where my students are at. Like I don't lecture really, but like when I speak, I choose who I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. And that's like a great way to know, like, oh, they have no idea what I'm saying, or they're doing great. So it's like part of me is like, I'm hoping this is getting there, and I'll see like when I read these later. So that's hard as a teacher. Like, there's just no adjustment in the moment. I'm also kind of the type of person who like plans to the 90%, and then leaves the last 10% because I'm like, I'm gonna change it anyways. Like in the moment, it's gonna be better. So you can't do that. That's been really hard for me. Like I have to have thought everything through. And then the other thing, the grading, just there's so much. You have to go through so much. And then I've kind of, not as much as others, but I've been trying to take it on myself to help other people. Because like I said, like there are things that aren't intuitive if you didn't grow up with a computer. But to me, I'm like, come on, you got to make this obvious. Like you should make there be a difference between the color of what you're supposed to read and where you're supposed to write. Like those are things that their brains will pick up on. If you just post a Google Doc that's all 12-point Times New Roman and there's no space for typing or anything, they're going to be turned off by that. They're not going to be able to follow what they're doing. So also like trying to help other people has been kind of tough too.
Yeah.
I feel like I answered your question. I don't know.
Yeah, you did. And you actually made me think of something that I really haven't thought of, is that, how many of these teachers that don't plan their lessons 100% out, that allow room for improvisation, that's got to be really difficult, especially like we all had that one professor or teacher who, had a couple bullet points about what they were going to talk about and then opened it up to the class for discussions and things like that. Well, now all of their lessons plans have fallen through. How have you seen teachers, like obviously you're probably a little bit more prepped, as you said, one, because you're a millennial, two, just because of who you are. But for those teachers who maybe kind of left a lot of it open to improvisation, how have they transitioned into being professors or being online?
Again, and I genuinely would love to hear anyone who hasn't seen this happen at their school. But a bigger switch to what I would call more traditional learning. Even in science, I'm lucky because I can give a textbook reading and know that like they're getting something from it because they need to know that information. But I'm like, traditional learning like that in English, in history, where you don't have the discussion, that sounds rough. There's some really great ideas I've seen for like that. There's teachers that are doing like virtual discussions where you have to respond to each other, because a lot of the I can't remember the direct quote, but it's something like most of teaching is just asking questions, and I would agree with that. Like whenever a student asks me a question, I always respond with a question, and it's not because I'm an asshole. It's just I'm a firm believer that like if I don't come to the realization myself, I'm never going to learn it. So like there's been a big switch to here's a textbook reading, here's a video, and I worry about like that adjustment. So I would say most teachers have kind of have switched back to what I would call more traditional learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I think for some students that's going to be great. I think that like a lot of them are going to love that, but you are going to lose. I also like I'm a big believer of like if a kid asks a question that's interesting to me, if a kid wants to talk about genetic engineering, like I'm going to stop my class and talk about genetic engineering. Like I don't care if I have to pick up on it the next day. Um, so we lose that, which sucks.
Yeah, that Joe Rogan style of teaching, where you're just willing to go down any rabbit hole.
You got it. I mean, if a kid brings up a good rabbit hole, now there are students that will do that. I was the type of student who did that on purpose, and so you got to be mindful. But if a student asks you an interesting question, like I don't know, you just got to go for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not in the business of creating fake like a fake ambition to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the business of finding the ambition to learn.
Yeah.
Like every human wants to learn and wants to be amazing. And like you never find someone who's like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you gonna do today? And they're like, be the worst I can be. Like, no, they just need to be in the right avenue.
Yeah, and I haven't really thought about that kind of secondary and tertiary learning that you have when you're in the classroom, like that kind of going down a rabbit hole that either the professor knows about or doesn't know about, and then you learn a lot more from that adds into that class. Not having that secondary and tertiary ability to learn and only sticking to the primary stuff too, that's got to hinder a lot of kids' abilities.
And you're modeling curiosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it feels good to just be like, oh yeah, I don't know. I wonder if it's this, or I wonder if it's that. Like that's modeling, and it's good for students to see. You're not having that as much anymore.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that these type of conversations that we're having right now, especially talking about kind of the philosophy of teaching, are being had with a lot of teachers, especially as we look at the transition back to being in the classroom. Has your school started to put in any, or have you personally started to do that planning for what that looks like? Because even if, say, potentially we don't have school next semester, but assuming that there is school next semester, you have that summer break, but you're still going to have an adjustment period from being virtual for half a semester to going back into the classroom.
I hope there's like twofold things that happen. One, I hope that like people start to name and care more about the stuff that we've been talking about, naming the character building and naming, the intangible learning, the modeling that we were talking about just now. Like I think it's a big thing. The other thing I'll say, and might ruffle feathers, is like, here's the thing. It's not like online learning is new. It's not like computers are new. This technology has existed for a very long time. Now, I do think that it was a failure of the powers that be, and nothing to do with my school, like truly above the school level, probably more at the state, federal level. There should have been a plan in place. There just should have been. It should not fall on individual schools, in my opinion, or at least it shouldn't have to. That being said, I do think that there was a big letdown that teachers across the country weren't ready for this, that they weren't already doing these things. There's things like reverse classrooms where students watch videos at home and then come into school for discussions. And to me as a teacher, I'm like, wow, this is proof that the kids can do it. One, it's meaningful to some students too. And whoa, I'd way rather be spending the time on the other thing. So to me, I'm like, this is affirming that this is actually a decent model of learning with the added being in person. And I think that, like, I hope there's more discussion about, okay, I hope what does not happen is that we get to school and they're like, okay, never go back to Google Classroom again. I hope we come back and be like, okay, what was really cool about that? What are you going to keep doing, right? And keep doing at home, because we know our students can do it and probably like it at some points. Because, I mean, there's a good amount of research that shows that remote learning with added in school is good for you. And also, like, that's what a lot of colleges do, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm really hoping that more people take that up. I really hope.
Yeah, and obviously, you and I have talked about the school system before and how it was kind of modeled off the factory setting and, obviously kind of built around a time that no longer exists. I'm hoping that there is some ability to have a hybrid model of schooling, especially even for high school and elementary, even at a public school, those sorts of things are able to happen, because I've talked with other people more specifically about work than school, but kind of I think a lot of people during this time are going to realize that, oh, my work is not worth 8 hours a day, or why am I spending a 9 to 5 job working on something that takes me 3 hours to do from home? I think that's going to happen in the classroom as well too, where we kind of realize we don't need to have this much in classroom time to accomplish the same amount of stuff.
No, also to me, it's like, oh, I don't need to spend my class time just delivering content.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think not doing that, I'm like, wow, I feel great, and part of that's because I have more free time, but I'm like, I'm not stressing out about are you listening to this thing, and that's where management problems come from, because that shit's boring. No one wants to do that. I'd way rather go in and just be like, okay, so you watched this video last night, let's talk about it, and why does that happen, and why are our genetics really important to us, and how do our genetics affect the way we look at ourselves as 21st century humans compared to what the 19th century would have looked at themselves without genetics. That's the topics I want to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's oh, this is reaffirming that I don't need to do this in person.
Yeah.
And I think that also you hit on the head too. I'm not just saying high school, students should be having, and I know there's a big, let's not have technology in front of our students, 100% with social media. Yeah. But should you have a Google Doc with a reading on it in front of a second grader? Yeah. What do you think is gonna go wrong? It's that's good. And then that's where intangibles like graphic design come from. That you know what I mean? And spatial awareness. Creating a document is all about creating a PowerPoint. It's all spatial awareness.
Yeah.
And that's tangible things to teach.
And it's these second graders, third graders, most of the time are going to go home and be on technology anyways. Why not, include that in more of your actual classroom curriculum?
Yeah. So I think that there's a big conversation, and I don't think it's unfair that right now that's not happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the focus is where it's supposed to be, which is let's support our students. It's hard, and also how do you create the community for our students where they're not in a community? One of the things I've been doing, I've been playing Jackbox TV games with my students.
Yes.
Which I'm sure a lot of people have played, where I just put it on my iPad, and it's super fun. But that's part of what school is, right? Is going and having fun with people and reminding them, hey, the world is okay. We're gonna make it.
Mm-hmm. It's even kind of. I think about those social media posts that I see that are not related to coronavirus, and you're kind of like, oh my gosh, this person's talking about something other than that. But, especially as a teacher, you got to remember, these kids can't be obsessed with coronavirus at all times and how it's going to impact them. They still have classes and need to have fun and all this different stuff. Whereas you and I, with, more research and more it's really impacting us, it shouldn't impact the students quite as much. So how do you bring a sense of normalcy to this really weird time?
Yeah, it's super important, especially for these students that are, for me, they're not in a normal time. They're teenagers, man. It's not supposed to be normal for them.
Very fair point. High school is weird no matter what time you were in.
Yeah, and I went back and forth because I had the ability in my content area to teach about the coronavirus, and part of the reason why I decided not to was I don't want to put more focus on this thing. I'm not an expert, because there are experts, but also there's 30 of them telling me different things. Every day my girlfriend wakes up and tells me something new about how I'm gonna die. But so I was but also I don't want that to be their focus.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about other cool things that are happening in science. Maybe I'll make the connection for them. If a kid asks me, but when we were still in school, I was I will answer anything you ask me, right? But I'm going to keep teaching, because that's not going to become our lives, and we're going to live through this, and we're going to need to know how to do that.
And I think you kind of perfectly described why I wanted to start this podcast, and essentially what my goal of this podcast is the fact that coronavirus to me is such a big deal that it's going to impact everything. Business is not going to be the same, schooling's not going to be the same after that, but in that regard too, there's supposed to be some sense of normalcy to what was before coronavirus. So it's kind of interesting to talk to people from many different industries about how do you keep your aim on what is going to change with coronavirus now and in the future, and how do you also keep that normalcy that was there before, so that not everybody is completely freaked out when the transition happens.
Yeah, you know what's been cool is there's been like no talk about like this individual celebrity did this thing. And I'm like, yeah, like that's kind of nice to go on online and not care about Kim Kardashian. Although that's not a big deal to me. Um, but the thing I think is crazy. Whenever I look back and see like the decades, I've always thought it's so wild that the decades were so distinct because I personally felt like the 2000s and the 2010s were very similar, other than I guess 9/11 somewhere in there. But this is the type of scenario where you're like, whoa, I can really see how like one incident really changes everything. Like I think that collectively as our collective zeitgeist, as our collective consciousness, it's gonna really shift, and I can really see how the 2020s are gonna be distinctly different because I don't see how this would not change us all as a collective. And maybe we will have the Roaring Twenties. Maybe this will be something that happens like World War II, where we come back. I mean, I've been thinking about it just because I keep seeing video calls of my students. I'm like, what is that moment going to be like where I am in a room with all my students? Like, am I going to be afraid to get close to them? Am I going to be in tears because I just haven't seen them? And so, like, I have no idea what that's going to be like, right?
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see, but the only thing I think I know for sure is like it's going to feel different, and it's going to, I think as a culture we're going to have a really big shift, which I'm personally really excited for. I think that there was a lot of there's a lot brewing up in our culture in the last couple of years, and I think that this might be really nice to be kind of a reset.
And we've talked about this at length for hours on hours on hours, especially like what are some of the issues that we are seeing, as 24, 25-year-olds, and then also like what kind of some solutions that could be had. But, in a lot of ways, like the problems that we saw were not going to get fixed the way the world or way we were currently set up. So like a big transition like this actually, while people see it as a big, scary, anxiety-inducing thing, also has the ability to transform things for the better in a way that it never would have had we not had this big, problem.
And like, what a great time to know how great education is, but two, what education is supposed to be. Like, I think that we said it already, that there should be a more focus in education about character building, but also like we shouldn't have an educational system that is our main provider of food to our people.
Yeah.
We shouldn't rely on an education system for our children to have food. And like the fact that slowed down the closing of schools allegedly, that's not like being good, like, and kind to keep the school systems open. No, that's just like rot in our society. That was the problem.
Yeah.
And like, I think also like, even if this doesn't change the generations before us, how are like, I can't see a world where my students don't grow up and say like, we gotta fix that. That's fucked up.
Yeah. Even my 12-year-old neighbor who is catching on to some things that, I just think in a really interesting way, this has put a mirror on who we are as people in America. And, I think a lot of people are able to see problems that, maybe a small minority had seen, but now it comes to life in a big way that I'm not even sure 9/11 or 2008 did. Now, obviously, I wasn't old enough to remember quite the impacts of those, but it'd be interesting to talk to somebody who's a little bit older. And this kind of leads me into one of the closing questions that I've been asking all my guests. And I actually don't want you to talk to it from an educational standpoint. I just want you to talk about it in general. Like, what's one of the biggest silver linings that you see? We kind of already touched on it, but like, even outside of kind of just the general psyche change of America, what's a big silver lining you think we're going to see from all of this?
So, time. So many people have time off, and that's horrible financially. I get that. Like, I totally get that. But also, like, even me, who's someone who's still working full time, because I'm home all the time, it's like, you have to like actively arrange what's important to you and actively add the things back in that you're missing. And I think that's like something that's been really missing in our society because of how fast paced it is. But like I've seen even just, and I think this is just on like an individual level, even in my apartment, the amount of yoga happening, the amount of people going on jogs. I've been woodworking just to keep just to keep doing something with my hands to keep more physically connected. Um, you're aware that I think UBI is a really interesting idea,
Yin Gang
and
for
to me,
life.
besides the fact that it is now happening to a
Well,
certain
pretty
extent.
poorly, but it's happening.
Um, to me, I'm like, oh yeah, here's proof that like the doubters were wrong. Like, I see more and more people rising up and filling their lives with things that are important to them, rather than sinking into their couches. And I think that's really awesome. And I think that we're going to see a lot of people. I think we're going to see a lot of. This might be crazy. I think we might see a lot of career changes. I think we might see a lot of people realizing what they want to do, realizing what they don't want to do, realizing they want to have kids, they don't want to have kids, finding new passions. Like, I just think this is going to be a big
Mhm.
awakening. Even just like more time to think, because at some point you're going to hit that point where Netflix is too much, and you're going to sit alone with your thoughts.
Mhm.
You don't have to do that every day if you
No.
fill your day with a job. That's where I think the growth is going to happen as a society. I've seen it in myself. Um, you know, I've filled every day. It's very rare that I spend a day where I'm watching Netflix, um, and I see it all around me. And I think that that's where the collective change in consciousness is going to happen.
Mhm.
And I think that we're going to be happier
Yeah.
after this. I really do.
I think so too, and especially like, as you kind of and I have talked about in the past, I've even been caught up in this kind of hustle culture and this hustle mania, and right now being at home and not feeling like I have to rush a card game with my family because I've got so much to do. It's like, well, I'm going to wake up and be in the house tomorrow, so some of this stuff can be delayed till tomorrow morning and do it when we kind of have our scheduled time versus feeling like I need to cut this card game short because I got stuff to do. I think that's a huge one too. And then another positive, I guess it depends on how you think, but I think marriage rates, there'll be a divorce rate increase once everybody gets out of isolation because they'll have to talk to their spouse for the first time. But after that, I think there's going to be an increase in the amount of marriages because people want something tangible that is a family or kids or something like that where it means so much more to you than even your career or your job. And obviously there's going to be people who are always more career oriented, but I think a lot of people got caught up in this hustle culture and they don't necessarily, not in a bad way, but they don't have the skills to succeed in hustle culture. And I think, that's obviously more people
Or
than
that they
not. And
actually
so,
get anything out of it. Like,
yeah, exactly. You kind of, when you live in one of those cities, New York, LA, where it's a lot of people move there for hustle culture and probably end up leaving burnt out, 10, 15 years later.
yeah, it's numbing, is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really think most people spend most of their lives trying to escape their mind, right? And so, like, getting on the subway, going to work, coming home, finishing your work,
Mm-hmm.
getting your kids ready for bed, reading your book before bed, like, filling all of your time is just stopping yourself from having to think. Um, and I get that. I'm not saying I don't do that. I live in New York. I'm a public school teacher. I have no time, right? This is like that's what I constantly do. And even if it's like just spending more time putting an audiobook on and going for a jog, I think that that's way more connecting to your body,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think people are going to find it's more and I think what we're both hitting at is like the just more naturally fulfilling things. Yeah, kind of going back to family and friends and good food. Probably a lot of people cooking for the first time in a while.
Yeah.
Um, Hobbies. I think that stuff's really important. And I know it's lame, and I know that it's funny, like to say like that's gonna change the world, but like, yeah, how else are you gonna do it? Like,
Yeah,
give.
exactly. I think, being, and really the only way to get through a time like this, especially when you take a look at like Trump's CDC guide, not Trump's, but the CDC guidelines kind of having all of the normal shelter in place and all that through April 30th, we still got a month of this. You're going to have to become an individual to get through this because, as I saw that great tweet of like my top 3 hobbies, I guess, were restaurants, bars, and non-essential businesses. Like, that's a lot of people out there. And so, you're going to have to become an individual to get through this, which I think is going to help out in a lot of ways. So, Bob, thank you so much for coming on today. It
Yeah.
is really interesting to hear about what a big, the biggest public school system in the country, we'll fact check that and make sure, but should be the biggest public school system in the country is doing to adjust and kind of, don't blame it on the teachers that they weren't prepared for this. There's systemic failings at the top that were, caused for all these problems. So,
no one jumped on it. I mean, probably the only people who are working just as hard, much harder, are the, obviously the healthcare workers. But I mean, if you know a teacher, thank them, because everyone that I work with, and I know it's probably representative of most, there was not a moment of like, oh shit, what are we gonna do? It was, oh shit, let's do it. And no one was taking the back road. So big kudos to them. No one said, well, why don't we just give them a break? It was, let's give these kids education.
Mm-hmm. And I talked to somebody, and their silver lining about the whole coronavirus was that there was going to be the right people going into medicine and wanting to be nurses and doctors. And maybe that happens in education, where there's all these new people that have a calling to go into education because they see now how short and how neglected a lot of the areas of the education system are. And I think, we could end up seeing a lot of way better teachers and professors after this.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Well, thank you, Bob, for coming on. And until next time, Corona Kids, we'll see you on the other side.